Welcome back to Pathways to Mental Wellbeing. My name is Jared Mueller. I'm an independently licensed social worker with a supervision designation. I've been working in the mental health field for over 20 years here in the Dayton area. Today, we're going to talk about conflict resolution. The reality is, often we talk about conflict as if it's a bad thing. And while there can be some negative outcomes, conflict is normal, it should be expected, and in the end, it's actually a positive thing. Conflict, crisis, it creates opportunities. We need to sharpen each other. We need to have some engagement in conflict to help us grow, to help us change. It really is an important part of the process. When people just agree, it leads to stale and homogenized kind of groupthink. In a lot of ways, it creates some exclusivity from those who think like you and those who do not. Conflict actually arises as a way to help us change. Or it can lead us down the road to reassert kind of an agreement that we have with each other. It's a vital part of the process of being in relationships, being in community, or really even being in business. Avoiding it just tends to lead to an undercurrent between people, their internal, whatever it is, it creates this disjointed nature within community, within ourselves, and within our organization. Conflict allows us to work through things, to either see the change that we want or come back to whatever agreement we've already had. Appropriate conflict should be welcomed. We should want it. Now, obviously, it's very important that it is appropriate conflict. Conflict becomes negative when we don't trust each other, when we believe the other person is out for their own gain or has some kind of ideas that are kind of behind the scene and they are manipulating or they're working against us or working against the organization. Conflict can be negative when one or both take defensive stances, when we're not open to change. Conflict can turn out to be negative. Instead of working together to either lead to change or to reassert your agreement, once one or many parties become defensive, well, neither one of those things are likely. Change is unlikely because one or many people are defending their ideas, and we're not going to come to an agreement if we're not willing to hear each other. Conflict is negative, and to be honest, community and families and organizations are negative when me is greater than we. When we are in relationships with each other, our goals need to be about we. If they're only about me, we will tend to lead to unhealthy relationships, unhealthy organizations, unhealthy communities. Now, me is important, but me is important for me to decide if I want to be engaged in that relationship, in that community, or in that organization. But once I'm engaged in it, it is my responsibility, it is our responsibility to be focused on the we. It also can become really negative and unhelpful when it's all about the outcome or it's all about winning. If I go into any kind of situation with the goal of getting what I want out of it, unfortunately, we will then struggle because then it's not about we, it's not about the possibility of change or agreeing again on something. Instead, it's just about me getting my way. It's about the outcome. And what ends up happening and is often unhealthy when it's conflict is the game of tetherball. If you've never been on a campground or a playground that had tetherball, it's a pretty simple game. There's a pole, there's a rope or a string, and there's something similar to a volleyball, but a lot harder than a volleyball on the end of that rope or string. And two people are on each side of that, hitting the ball back and forth at each other. The reality of the game of tetherball is it only ends when that ball is wrapped all the way around the pole in one direction. Whoever's direction has it wrapped around wins that game. The problem is if two people are playing tetherball, the ball tends to go harder and faster as they're trying to win the game. Conflict, like tetherball, can be dangerous when it's me versus you. The reality of conflict is there are stages to the process. Understanding the stages can help us understand how to react. And it's vital, especially if we are the one engaged with someone who is starting to get emotional, right? They're starting to try to play tetherball with us. Well, we don't want to play tetherball. We want to step out of the game. And in order to do that, we need to make sure we're reacting appropriately to the different stages of conflict. So the first stage that we're going to talk about is questions, but there are two forms of questions. The first is information-seeking questions or informational questions. If someone, no matter how loud they are, no matter what language they're using, if they are seeking information, it is our responsibility to answer those questions. Again, it doesn't matter how they're asking them. If they are seeking a piece of information that you have available, you answer the question. If you don't have it, be honest about the fact that you don't have that answer, you don't have that information. But this is where conflict, again, the tetherball concept, can become problematic if we don't like how they're saying it, the words that they're using, their tone of voice. Even if they're asking information-based questions, we can actually escalate the conflict. Now, there is a second type of questioning, and that's a challenging question. How dare you? What gives you the right? And again, much like the information seeking, that could be asked in a loud or cursive manner. It can also be asked very quietly, very calmly. But the reality is challenging questions need to be ignored or redirected. Challenging questions, the goal is to suck you into that game of tetherball, that you're going back and forth with the other person. Instead, we can just ignore what they asked and move on, move the subject back to what we want to talk about. Or we can verbally do that by saying, I understand that's important to you, but right now we are talking about this. Challenging questions are normal during conflict, but it's up to us to respond appropriately to those questions. The third kind of stage in conflict is refusal. Bluntly, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to change. They are stopped in their process. And that's where we need to set limits. Again, whether this is in a workplace or a relationship, we need to set limits of what we are going to do. We cannot set limits of what they are going to do. We don't have control of other people, but we need to set limits in conflict to just say, hey, if that's where you're at, then I don't think it's beneficial for us to continue this conversation today. So I am going to go into the other room, go back to my office. I'm going to go take a walk. Or it could be, hey, let's go ahead and let's take a 30-minute break. And we'll come back together in 30 minutes and continue our conversation, right? We're setting limits. We're not engaging in the refusal. We're not trying to convince them to change. We are just setting limits of what we are going to do. That also could be things like, listen, because it's escalated this far, we're going to ask security to come and escort you out, or we're going to call the police, or whatever that is, but we have to set those limits. Sometimes it's great to tell them those limits. Sometimes those limits are going to be set inside of ourselves, but it's up to us when someone is in refusal to set our own limits and to move forward. Unfortunately, that doesn't always end the conversation. That doesn't always end the conflict. It's appropriate generally when there's conflict, especially about things people care about. Again, that could be in a relationship, that can be in family, that can be in work, that can be in community. There's going to likely be an emotional release because people care. So it's important when people are emotionally releasing is to understand at that point, they are not being logical. Words are not generally that helpful when someone is emotionally releasing. At that point, the best thing to do is to make sure people are safe and allow the venting. To try to stop the venting is much like trying to stop a pot that is steaming with a lid. It might blow that lid off. Instead, we allow the venting. We try to turn down the heat by not engaging that game of tetherball so that the emotional release can come down and then maybe and hopefully they're able to appropriately respond. Threats takes emotional release to the next level. Now, everybody has to define for themselves what they believe a threat is. Generally speaking, it's important to think of a threat as something that is possible, that they are capable of doing, and that could cause harm. If there is a threat, I'm going to punch you, I'm going to knock you out, I'm going to, whatever that is, and it is a credible threat. You believe it's a credible threat. It's vital for you first to create some distance to make sure you are safe, and then to get help. Again, whatever that help looks like, the goal is safety, not to control them, not to make them, but it's to create safety. Generally speaking, if this is in a workplace, you want to get other coworkers involved, human resources. If this is community, you want to get anybody nearby that's a bystander that can be of support. Family, we may want to distance ourselves. Law enforcement can often be involved at this point in time when there are threats. And finally, there's the final stage, which is calming. In the end, when there's conflict, it is vital that there's some level of debrief, as long as that is a safe thing to do. We want to process, how did we get here? What could I have done better? What could you have done better? We are back to we orientation. It allows us to reconnect with each other, to have the goals of whatever that relationship is. It's important as we kind of get to that reconnect, and even before that we understand that all behavior has a purpose. The reality is, though, most people don't know the reason for their own behavior. But as we're interacting with people, we have to realize there is purpose behind their behaviors. That can help us in conflict to realize that person may be getting upset for a valid reason that you may not understand, they may not understand, but there is purpose behind behaviors. But it really is almost impossible to understand somebody else's purpose. But as long as we understand that there is a purpose, it can help us try to understand people we are in conflict with, instead of assuming they're just not thinking, that they're just acting wild. Trying to understand that there is a purpose behind their behaviors can help us while we're in conflict. It can calm us down so that we're not escalating into that tetherball relationship. It's also vital that we realize, while we may not agree with them, we may not even like them, other people's thoughts and feelings are valid. Doesn't mean they're smart, doesn't mean they're rooted in logic, but other people's thoughts and feelings are valid and they're important to them. We cannot just dismiss them because we disagree with them. That does not bring us back to unity. That does not bring us to we. That continues the me versus you. But the reality is they have thoughts and feelings that are valid as yours are. But we know that the emotions are not logical. In the end, as we finish conflict, it's important that our agreements and our decision makings are based on logic. Our emotions are important, and they can be a part of the conversation. But in the end, whether it's reaffirming an old agreement, an old decision to stay together, to continue to work on a project, to continue to go in a certain direction, or it's a decision to change, in that conflict, it is vital that the answer is logical. Because our feelings, they wax and wane. If we make decisions or agreements today based on today's feelings, especially right after conflict, by tomorrow, we may feel differently. They must be rooted in logic. It's also important to realize that in conflict, you may have power, you may have a position. That doesn't mean you have control. And trying to assert your power to control people often again leads to that tetherball idea. In conflict, the biggest goal is that we get back to we. Trying to assert our power doesn't bring us back to we. It once again is you versus me. And finally, in conflict, the process. Going through whatever that conflict is more important than the outcome. Because that process will either bring us closer together, closer to agreement, or it can help us decide that we need to part ways in whatever that relational interaction is. that process, going through it appropriately, processing appropriately, is vital in conflict. For those of you in a Christian perspective, which is an important part of all of this, and you might be able to hear some language throughout this presentation that talked about community and being together. The reality is the Bible provides us a recipe for conflict resolution. It's to go to that person, and if they can't hear you, bring somebody else that they respect and that you respect, that and go together, and then that builds right into the leaders and to the church as a whole. But there is actually a recipe biblically about conflict resolution, and it's actually about resolving the conflict. It's not about pretending it didn't happen. It's not about talking about it in pockets. It's about going to each other, and that's where that trust, that common bond of Christ is vital. Proverbs 15 is a great chapter. I would be lying if I said that I'm great at memorizing. Just want to encourage you to look through that chapter as it talks about having soft answers. When we come together in care and love, not about outcomes and achievements and all of that, we tend to find the resolution to conflict that God wants for us. We're also told we need to bear with one another. That means at times there's going to be things we don't like about each other, that frustrate us about each other. We need to bear with that. It's our role as a community in Christ to work together, not try to change people, try to make them, but to actually bear with them, with what they're going through, and as they grow and as they learn and as they progress in their faith journey. And finally, Ephesians talks about replacing corrupt talk with kind speech. When we talk in love, we talk in God's language. And we want to encourage you in faith to be talking in God's language, not in the world's language, not in our own selfish, me-oriented language, but in we language. Thank you for coming by today and listening to today's talk on conflict resolution. I hope you have found some things that bring you closer to mental well-being when it comes to your community, your families, your organizations. Again, my name is Jared Mueller. Thank you for stopping by, and have a great day.